Good morning and welcome to today's webinar titled Low Expectations Getting Lower, EU-China Relations After the EU-China Summit. My name is Lyle Morris, Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy and National Security at Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. And today's webinar will focus on the outcomes of the 25th EU-China Summit, which was held at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on July 24th. During the summit, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa met with PRC President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang to discuss issues related to trade imbalances, technology restrictions, and China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine. EU leaders raised concerns over China's export surplus, flooding European markets with cheap goods, China's recent restrictions on rare earth exports to the EU, and Beijing's significant and expanding trade ties with Moscow, and the offering of dual-use material that aids Russia's military in Ukraine. With the exception of a joint statement on climate change and procedures for emergency exports of rare earth metals to the EU, I think it's safe to say that few breakthroughs were made during the summit. The joint statement reaffirmed the two sides' modest commitments to deepening cooperation on green energy, and the agreement on rare earths created a, quote, fast-track license mechanism for delays in critical raw material exports, which the EU believes were unilaterally restricted by China. Instead, the meeting featured pointed remarks by leaders on both sides on how to resolve the underlying sources of tension while ensuring such tension does not derail broader economic and trade flows between the two sides. So Xi, for his part, urged EU officials to, quote, properly handle differences and frictions, adding that the challenges facing Europe, quote, do not come from China, end quote. He said that he hoped Europe would, quote, keep its trade and investment markets open and refrain from using restrictive economic and trade tools, end quote. He also said, quote, called on the EU to foster a sound business environment for Chinese enterprises investing and operating in the EU, end quote. So the EU joint statement stressed a few things. First, it said, called for deepening engagement, must lead to concrete progress on issues of joint interest and more productive work towards a balanced and mutually beneficial economic relationship built on fairness and reciprocity. So von der Leyen said that the EU side had frankly and openly raised their concerns to China on trade, investment, and geopolitical issues, adding that we, quote, have partially identified solutions, end quote. She added that the Chinese leadership has started to look into the overcapacity issue and expressed willingness to support more consumption of EU goods in China. Finally, on Ukraine, von der Leyen said China should use its influence on Russia to encourage negotiations over Ukraine. And Costa, for his part, added that the EU is asking China to pay attention to their exports to Russia to avoid dual-use goods that could be used for war purposes. So I think overall the summit met the low expectations that both sides had ahead of time and seemed to underscore a pivotal shift in EU-China relations. The EU is re-examining its overall relationship with Beijing and Washington, D.C. There's mounting frustration over Chinese excess capacity, dumping of goods in Europe, and export controls on rare earths. The underwhelming, I guess you could say, underwhelming results of the summit may lead the EU to focus internally on how best to utilize its leverage over China to extract concessions. And then for Beijing, I think they'll have to grapple with key questions over how or whether they're willing to accommodate EU concerns, which would require concessions on overcapacity and efforts to rebalance the trade relationship. So to help us discuss these outcomes, I'm very pleased to be joined by Plamen Tonchev and Philippe, who will help us unpack some of the takeaways from the summit to include key outcomes, atmospherics, and where EU-China relations are headed from here. So Plamen is the head of Asia unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Greece, a position he has held since 1998. In addition, Plamen has acted as an external expert for the European Commission on a long list of EU missions overseas. He is also a founding member of the European think tank Network on China, or ETNC, and a contributor to its annual reports. Plamen, I know we had some technical issues, but are you here this morning?
Yes, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear. Thanks for joining. So next we have Philippe Lecour, Senior Fellow at Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and a Senior Advisor on Geopolitics to Asia Society France. Philippe is also a Professor of Geopolitics affiliated with the ESSEC Business School, as well as a Professor at the French Military Academy. So Plamen and Philippe, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here, Lyle.
Thank you, Lyle.
Okay, great. So let's dive into some questions before we open up to Q&A. Again, if you're joining us virtually, please add your questions in the Q&A comment box, and I'll get to them at the end if we have time. So before we jump into the summit and the outcomes of the summit, I want to ask you two, Plamen and Philippe, about what happened, what was the tone and the background of the state of EU-China relations before the summit. So if you go back a few months, go back however long you want, last several months, and help us understand what was going on in the relationship that kind of led up to the summit itself. I mean, what was the state of EU-China relations? And what were some of the key, I guess, policies or rhetoric that was said on both sides, China and the EU, that kind of set the stage for the summit itself? So kind of just a backgrounder, if you will, on kind of what the EU and China relationship was before the summit occurred. So Plamen, if I could start with you, help us understand kind of before the summit, what was going on in the relationship and how did that influence the summit itself?
Yes, thanks very much, Lyle, and apologies for this technical glitch. I cannot be with you in optical terms, but I agree that it would be very helpful if we understood the context of this summit in the wake of a number of developments over the past 6 months, because there have been very many ups and downs since last January and Donald Trump's return to the White House. And we cannot see the Beijing summit outside the triangle of the US-EU-China relations. I would say that from a psychological point of view, this period since last January, in the lead up to the summit, was marked by the alteration of contrasting feelings and a sequence of changing emotions. And it's helpful to have a look at the timeline of the run-up to the summit. Let's remember that last February, a series of statements by Donald Trump and other top US officials left no doubt that Europeans would be excluded from negotiations about the war in Ukraine, which in Trump's view was meant to be a bilateral business between Washington and Moscow. And then last February, Vice President J.D. Vance stunned his audience at the Munich Security Conference with a lecture on what he perceived as Europe's flawed democracy. In contrast, the Chinese foreign minister's speech on the very same day was music to European ears. Wang Yi came up with all the pleasantries and nice sound bites you can think of. And among other things, the audience was more than happy to hear him state that Europe should play a role in the peace negotiations on Ukraine. Next, on the 28th of February, I think, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Zelensky had their notorious shouting match in the White House, which confirmed Europeans' worst fears. They felt ignored, insulted, and abandoned by the United States, and they panicked. It is against this backdrop that at about the same time, the European Commission's President von der Leyen hinted at a possible rapprochement with Beijing by identifying some room for the EU to engage constructively with China. This hedging strategy was not affected by the fact that last March, Xi declined an invitation to visit Brussels for a summit marking the 50th anniversary of EU-China diplomatic relations. Instead, the EU leadership accepted to travel to Beijing for the sake of having some face time with the big boss. And in April, as part of its charm offensive, China lifted some of the sanctions on EU institutions and politicians, which it had slapped back in 2021. And yet in May, the mood in the EU changed quite a bit. By then, it had become quite clear that Beijing's charm offensive was purely performative, and China wasn't ready to make any meaningful concessions in Europe. And then in June, at the G7 summit in Canada, von der Leyen issued one of the strongest rebukes of China to date, accusing Beijing of export restrictions, state-subsidized overproduction, and whatnot. The European Parliament, too, condemned Beijing's rare earth export restrictions as unjustified and coercive. So I would say that the run-up to the summit was, in a way, more interesting than the summit itself. If I'm to summarize the last 6 months in a single sentence, I would speak of a tumultuous run-up to an underwhelming summit.
Thank you, Plamen. That really helps set the stage for what was to come. Philippe, do you anything to add on Plamen's kind of overview of what happened? Anything else stand out to you kind of in the run-up that you think kind of influenced the summit itself?
So I think the state of affairs is obviously not very good at the moment between the EU and China. And in fact, there was very little surprise about the summit itself because everything had been more or less said between the two sides, especially during the strategic meeting. You know that China and the EU have several regular meetings every year, more or less. The strategic meeting, the trade and economic meeting, and the people-to-people exchange, and the summit. So the economic and trade meeting was just cancelled, which speaks volumes for the state of the trade relations. The people-to-people meeting will take place, and there was even a meeting on human rights of all subjects in Brussels in June. But the most perhaps significant prior interaction between the EU and China was the visit by Foreign Minister and Politburo member Wang Yi to Brussels when he exchanged with High Representative Kaja Kallas and told him in a very straightforward way, even though, obviously the Chinese side didn't mean to publicize this comment, but it did come out very quickly that it was not in China's interest for Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine to stop and to be for Russia to be defeated in the Ukraine war. And that sort of sent shockwaves to EU officials who, of course, had very little expectations in terms of, China switching gears and perhaps helping the Europeans to sort out the Ukrainian issue, which was, of course, started by Vladimir Putin. But I think to hear that in the voice of the foreign minister himself really set the tone of the summit, which in fact could have happened or not happened. It didn't seem to matter very much to European officials just a few days before the summit, and some of our colleagues actually argued that the summit maybe should not have happened because there was too much going on, especially on the US-EU side, and I agree with Plamen on that. And on the US-China side, with, as we know, trade talks going on, and that's the other big, issue, of course, perhaps even more of a priority because the trade deficit in 2024 was 305 billion euro, 30% rise and counting. And I think, there's a real concern in the European side that China has adopted this very nationalist economic drive, advising Chinese consumers really to buy Chinese and not to buy European products, which of course is not helping the case. So I think, the summit did take place in the end, of course, just for one day. We're not quite sure why the first day was cancelled. There's some rumors that it may be because the EU imposed some sanctions on two Chinese banks that were involved in helping Chinese companies to export to Russia, and in the context of the Ukraine war. Or perhaps that the Chinese side decided, there wasn't enough content to be discussed. I mean, even though they did actually have this meeting between von der Leyen, Costa on one hand, and President Xi Jinping on the other hand. But apart from all of this context, which of course wasn't the best possible, it met the expectations of a regular meeting between the Chinese top leadership and the EU leaders. Xi Jinping doesn't seem to hold any respect or particular interest for these Chinese EU leaders. I mean, I'm sure we'll come back to the sort of EU versus individual states aspect, which is always interesting. But I think the conclusion we've heard from various sources was that China did not move an inch on either Ukraine nor the trade issues, and then we can, of course, discuss the other aspects. But just one word, I think, to remember from Ursula von der Leyen's statement. She said the EU and China are at an inflection point in their relationship. I think it's an important comment because it's not just the summit which is an inflection point. It's the relationship as a whole. And when you speak to EU officials in Brussels, you do have the feeling that we are actually a little bit on the edge at this stage, with a number of people in Europe being slightly pessimistic about the end game, so to speak.
That's great. You touched on a lot, Philippe, and you touched on the meeting with Wang Yi a week before the summit, which I think was a pretty pivotal meeting for the EU as far as really confirming some of the concerns that you had that China was not listening to EU concerns. And so I think, from my reading and, our trip to Europe, Philippe, it seems that meeting seems to have been really pivotal for kind of changing the tone and lowering expectations of what China was going to, concede to the EU. So Plamen, let me move back to you on this question, and I'll pose the same question to both of you. But so given the run up and then low expectations, China was signaling it was not going to make many concessions. What did we see from the summit? Did anything surprise you? What did the EU get out of the summit? Did they get anything that they could take back to their domestic audiences to show that that the EU-China relationship is moving in a positive direction, or were the expectations so low that there was already kind of an understanding that not much would come of the meeting? So Plamen, did anything surprise you from the summit? I guess that's my first question to you.
Well, yes, in fact, I was surprised a bit by the fact that EU leaders raised yet again the issue of China putting pressure on Russia because of the war in Ukraine. I do not think this is a constructive, stance, because I do not expect China to change its course. After all, China and Russia are strategic partners in what I would call their crusade against the liberal Western world order. That was the only surprise that I experienced. Otherwise, I think that this summit is likely to be remembered, not for what it achieved, because the outputs were really meager, but in fact the summit revealed the current state of EU-China relations, because China's dismissive response to the majority of European concerns signaled its confidence in its position of strength. And Beijing came across as being unwilling to make any meaningful concessions necessary for a genuine partnership with the EU. I would say that this summit was a repeat of the 2023 summit, which Josep Borrell back then famously commented on as the dialogue of the deaf. That's what he said, if you remember. There was no real headway in relation to geopolitical issues. Like I mentioned, the war in Ukraine. China still sticks to its strategic ambiguity, as it is officially neutral, but in reality, we all know that it's a key enabler of the Russian military machine. In terms of economic, trade relations, we know that results were, again, rather meager, with perhaps, some relaxation of procedures in terms of rare earth element flows to the EU, but that's to be seen. So what did the EU get out of the summit? You will remember that back in 2019, the EU came up with a triple definition of China as a partner, competitor, and a systemic rival. Since then, the needle has been moving steadily towards competition and systemic rivalry. So what the EU got out of this summit was simply the confirmation that China is now more of a competitor and a systemic rival than a partner. And I will stop at this. But I will definitely thank Philippe for reminding us of Wang Yi's visit to Brussels recently and his blunt confession that China just did not want to see Russia defeated. Thank you.
Philippe, same question to you.
Oh, anything positive, you mean, out of the summit? Well, I mean, the rare earth agreement, of course. I mean, what I find very surprising about this rare earth story is that it never came. I mean, it's a fairly new development of China putting pressure on other countries. I mean, it's been a couple of years perhaps since this appeared, but now it obviously appeared and in the U.S.-China dialogue, which you know so well, Lyle, which took place over the past few months in 3 different European locations, London, Geneva, and Stockholm recently, strangely enough. But, so the Europeans are extremely concerned, the European companies are extremely concerned that they are suddenly falling as victims of this pressure that China is putting on the US companies, which is, of course, a threat to the defense industry and to many other industries as well, not just in America, but in Europe. So basically the message from China, from the Chinese officials to the Europeans over the past few weeks, including during the summit, was, it's no big deal. It's just, it's nothing to do with you. And, we urge, individual companies to register individually so that, the value chain can be processed. And the EU, on the other hand, asked China officially to lift restrictions on rare earth and permanent magnets. But that was not the response from China. The response was, we're going to deal with it on an individual basis. The problem with that, it feeds the uncertainty, which is already, which has been created, of course, by Donald Trump's policies from January and by his own comments on Europe and his own and his vice president's comments, as opposed to having a sort of a transatlantic discussion on China, which sadly is not really happening as far as I can tell. The other aspect, which of course we should underline, is climate. Yes, there was a statement on climate. This is one of the issues where China and the EU like to have a discussion. But let me remind you that in terms of green energy, the EU is considered a fairly good citizen with a share of global gas emissions that has dropped to 6%. And a determination to reduce it to 4%. So the statement, the joint statement on climate was just a vague reaffirmation of previous commitments, as China continues to be the largest producer and consumer of coal in the world, about 4 billion tons of coal every year. They did, commit to cooperate on the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework, so that's positive, and to work on a balanced international treaty on plastic pollution. Now, of course, we know that these discussions were going on. It's good that something came out of the summit, but I would say they would have happened anyway. And the really big issue, which was not sorted, I would say, and the big elephant in the room, it's not just an elephant, it was actually addressed by the Europeans, is trade. As you know, Lyle, and Plamen, of course, knows this so well, the big story between the EU and China for the past, I would say, 40 years, or 50 years for that matter, since we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of EU-China relations, is trade. The EU has been this huge market and has attracted massive imports from China, and these have only been increasing. There has not been a geopolitical dialogue between the EU and China. There have been discussions between member states, perhaps like Germany, France, particularly, and the UK, which is now out of the EU, and other countries as well. But in terms of trade and the Chinese contribution to the European economy, as well as the European contribution to the Chinese economy, which is, of course, started much longer ago. I mean, in the late 70s and 1980s and 90s, there have been massive investments from European companies into China. The problem is now there are new policies that have been implemented over the past decade or so in China that are making life difficult for a number of European businesses, including German companies that are a massive player in this game, in this economic game, and are now wondering whether it's worth continuing to invest. So I know that BASF, for example, the chemicals group, continues to invest because China is a big market anyway. And I guess for chemicals, it's worth being in China. But for many consumer products, it's only products that are of interest to China, especially in IT products, that are really welcome for new investments in the Chinese markets.
Great. I want to drill down, Philippe, you mentioned climate, and I want to drill down into that, plus the war in Ukraine. But on trade, I mean, it seems like if you look at Xi's comments, they were very, what you'd expect, but, he had a few kind of pretty direct barbs at the EU saying, I remember most notably, he said the challenges facing Europe, quote, do not come from China, talked about the need to, handle differences and win-win and talking about the EU's role in kind of the trade imbalance. So, very much focused on not what China would do, but more about the need for open and reciprocal trade and kind of maybe deflecting blame that the EU had towards China. So at least rhetorically, Xi didn't give the EU much from what I can see. And then von der Leyen, she mentioned partially identified trade solutions. And then she also said, China's starting to look into the overcapacity issue, which we know is a big deal, especially with EVs. And then she also said that China's expressed a willingness to support more consumption. But we didn't see any concrete deliverables from that. So on the economic front, what do you two take away from the meeting. Was that expected? Was the EU hoping that China would, maybe have more concrete promises on opening the Chinese market or addressing overcapacity, or is this sort of what you expected? The more talking past each other with talking points and not any firm deliverables. Plamen, I'll start with you, and then Philippe.
Yes, thanks, Lyle. Speaking of China's industrial overcapacity, one of the few cute moments, if I may say so, was the word that von der Leyen used when she spoke about it. She actually used the term involution, which I thought was smart. And that's the term that Chinese authorities have now adopted as a euphemism for overcapacity and the ferocious price wars within China itself between Chinese companies. But you see, the Chinese authorities are still dismissing this argument while they're implicitly admitting there is an overcapacity predicament on the Chinese market. They clearly dismissed the European argument, which means that there's not much to be expected on this front. I do agree with you, Lyle, that indeed that the two delegations, the two sides traded barbs, even if thinly veiled. Yes, it is true that Xi Jinping spoke about making strategic choices, obviously referring to transatlantic relations. But I would say that China itself has already made its strategic choice in partnering with Russia. I do agree with Philippe, who mentioned the inflection point phrase. I think von der Leyen deliberately didn't say breaking point. She spoke of an inflection point. But this phrase quite clearly shows that, look, we cannot carry on like this anymore. Our relationship can only deteriorate from now on. And I would keep this as one of the, not just sound bites for the media, but I think that's one of the key messages coming out on summit. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the Chinese side has been trying for several months now to relaunch the comprehensive agreement on investment, which, as you recall, was signed under Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany's chairmanship of the European Union back almost 4 years ago, after a long negotiation. Now, the problem with this agreement, first of all, it's frozen, and I don't think any of the European countries want to. I mean, maybe a couple want to rediscuss with China, but I think that the EU was very clear in all meetings of the past few months, despite the lifting of some restrictions on members of the European Parliament. As you know, that's what Plamen was saying. China decided to, as a gesture of goodwill, to lift some restrictions on members of the European Parliament that were not allowed to visit China. But that didn't change anything on the core matter. Is that the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, is not the right tool to discuss the trade imbalances between the European Union and China. And in fact, what the Europeans, whether the EU institutions or individual states, or even businesses, companies, the EU Chamber of Commerce in China would tell you that the market access is the number one issue. And in fact, the EU Chamber of Commerce every year comes up with a position paper, usually in September. I'm sure we're going to have another one with a long list of sectors where, in fact, Europeans are facing red tape and can no longer evolve in the Chinese market because it's become so difficult. You know that in some sectors, the Chinese government does issue vouchers to Chinese consumers to buy Chinese goods. Now, there's nothing wrong with this on principle if European brands are allowed to sell and to do business in China. But in fact, in many cases, it's become difficult. I mean, there's no point encouraging investments, at least at this stage, I would say. We can discuss long-term investments, that's something different. But this comprehensive agreement on investment is not the right response to the question of overcapacity and trade imbalance. The Chinese side has to make more efforts to open its markets. It's not just to Europeans, but as it happens, the European economy has problems, and it needs to rebalance its trade relations so that it's not just across the board a deficit. And it's exactly what's happening now. I think there's one or two member states in Europe, I think Luxembourg and Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, that have a slight surplus with the PRC. And honestly, I know there are some arguments from the Chinese side saying that this is of Europe's own making. I don't think if you talk to European companies, that they would agree with this.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me touch on the two deliverables: the deliverable, the joint statement on climate change, and then the China's creation of a, quote, fast-track license mechanism for delays in critical minerals. From both perspectives, Beijing and Brussels, were these the most lowest hanging fruit possible, and sort of, a very modest deliverable, but something that both sides could count as wins? I mean, there's some in the EU who say, China basically unilaterally imposed restrictions on rare earths to the EU and to other countries. So this fast track license is sort of China undoing this unilateral policy. So and the criticism is that the EU didn't get much out of it because they weren't the ones who created this problem. It was China. So there is some voices in the EU kind of criticize that as not being a win for Europe, but just something that was self created by China. But just these two deliverables, what do you guys' take on the impact, if any, of a win in Brussels and Europe, Brussels and Beijing for these two deliverables? Plamen, let me start with you.
Right. I would think of three outcomes, three modest outcomes. The two that you mentioned, of course, the joint statement on climate change, which was indeed a low-hanging fruit. And by the way, the statement on climate change was agreed upon prior to the summit, right? Mm-hmm. And in a way, it was a fig leaf. It was meant to avoid giving the impression that the summit was a complete flop. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that it's insignificant. Of course, this joint commitment to combating climate change is important, but it was expected. On the mechanism to facilitate the fast tracking of licenses, I think it's called the Green Channel or something along these lines. It is also important, but again, I think there's a bit of a disingenuous attitude on the part of China, because the Chinese authorities are speaking of sort of accelerating the licensing, the permits to be issued for the flow of rare earth elements to Europe. It's not exactly an agreement to have an uninhibited flow of rare earths to Europe. It's just about accelerating, facilitating this procedure, which in the words of the Chinese officials is a matter of, procedures. It's a procedural issue. It's not a political issue. So I think that these procedures remain suspiciously slow and arduous, which doesn't help Europe a lot. It doesn't help European companies a lot. And the third modest outcome that I would, highlight is what Philippe said previously. The fact that the summit did take place was an outcome in itself. I suppose there were a lot of question marks over, this summit, its content, and whether or not it should take place at all. So the fact that it did take place may be seen as an outcome as well. Thank you.
Just one additional comment. I mean, I fully agree with what Plamen just said, but as you know, I mean, since Donald Trump came back to the White House in January, he has indeed withdrew a second time from the 2015 Paris Accord on climate. Now, when you look at the situation, the climate situation worldwide, it's of course very worrying for a lot of people, including in Europe, where, as I said earlier, people care a lot about climate issues. So one issue where China and Europe seem to be in agreement is that something has to be done, and we should aim at reducing our carbon footprints. The problem is, of course, China, as you know, since the launch of Made in China 2025 project 10 years ago, in fact, because we are in 2025, the list of technologies and sectors which China wanted to invest on for the following decade was and is, as we speak today, green tech. And green tech includes batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles, and anything. Of course, green technology, of course, being a major element, which of course has translated into within China a number of provinces investing, following the guidelines of the central government of China, investing, for example, in electric vehicles. And at some point, there were over 200 companies across China in different provinces producing EVs, which has led to an overcapacity, and which is actually the core of the problem, is that China now wants to sell millions of electric vehicles to the world, including to the European market. And the Chinese side would say to the European official, look, this is your policy. You've been telling your own people that it's important to reduce CO2 and then to drive electric cars rather than traditional vehicles. So why are you not buying our EVs, which are made in China? Or sometimes made in Europe, because that's the other leg of the story, I would say. And of course, from a European standpoint, the answer is not straightforward, because there is an issue that is actually the state of European industry and the future of European jobs as well. And the car industry in Europe is in a dire state. And the fact that we are converting from fueled vehicles to electric cars is not happening smoothly, because it's expensive. And China is coming up with this, of course, alternatives with brands that we all know, BYD, Geely, Chery. Chery is investing in Spain. BYD is investing in Hungary. And of course, we can speak volumes about the discrepancies between member states, which is not very helpful. But so China thinks, or pretends it's helping, the Europeans by matching the European policies on green tech, particularly.
Plamen, I want to follow up with one thing you said about Ukraine, which I thought was interesting, and then I'll end with one more question before we open up. We have about 12 minutes left. You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, that you were surprised that the EU raised China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine because of how tight the relationship is between, Moscow and Beijing. So did you not expect the EU to raise that? Because, when we were there, I mean, clearly the Ukraine issue is front and center. It's one of the biggest geostrategic security issues that they care about. So my question to you is, did you not expect them to raise it? And if you did expect them to raise it, did you expect them to say something different that might resonate with Beijing more than what they said?
Well, thanks, Lyle. A very brief answer. I mean, in light of what Wang Yi said in Brussels a month before the summit, that China does not want to see a defeated Russia, I mean, I really wonder, what did the EU officials expect to hear from their Chinese interlocutors in Beijing? They've raised this issue over and over again, and it was quite clear that the answer would be silence, if not a straightforward no. Yes, I am surprised because I think this is a non-starter. Raising this issue with China leads nowhere. That's my humble view.
Philippe, any thoughts on Ukraine? What outcomes from Ukraine in the summit?
Well, honestly, I beg to disagree slightly with Plamen, because I do think that European officials have to mention Ukraine. This is really, I mean, the most serious security situation that we've been facing since the fall of the Berlin Wall. There are countries that are deeply worried in Northern Europe, particularly, and also in Eastern Europe about Russia. And the fact that China seems to take for granted the fact that Europeans and China should do business as usual without mentioning Ukraine, which has been more or less the discourse of the past 3 years. The past 2 or 3 such meetings or summits have been, as Plamen said, quite truly, has been met by, a wall of silence and no response, or a response like, it's not China's business. But it's not true, really. Is it true? I mean, China has been not only selling more goods, consumer goods to Russia, and buying cheap oil and gas from Russia, has been supplying spare parts and semiconductors to Russia. The increase is dramatic. We're talking about 50% increase per year of Chinese exports into Russia. And also you've got the question of the DPRK, which I thought was interesting, that was mentioned in Ursula von der Leyen's statements. The fact that the North Korea, which is also a China ally, has been sending troops to support the Russian attack on Ukraine is not something China can ignore as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as a close neighbor and ally of North Korea. So the internationalization of the Ukrainian conflict is not just Europe's problem. It is a problem for the world community, especially of a country that is a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
If I can step in to clarify my point, Lyle, may I?
Yes, please.
I fully agree that this is a major item on the list of talking points of the EU, and the EU officials rightly, raise this issue. What I disagree with is expecting China to exert pressure on Russia to stop the war in Ukraine, because this is what Antonio Costa actually said in Beijing. And I think this is a non-starter. I do think that China should be held accountable for its de facto support to Russia. Yes, and this should be raised at all international fora. But to expect China to exert pressure on Russia is taking us nowhere. Over to you, Lyle.
Got it. Perfect. All right, we have 7 minutes left. I want to ask a final question and then try to get at least 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if you could just give me a short kind of bottom line summary, you two, about where the two sides go from here. I mean, low expectations, very modest outcomes of the summit. A lot of feedback from China to the EU that China is not interested in making major concessions to the EU's concerns. So where is, I guess, the EU side? Where does the EU go from here? Do they kind of look internally and looking at how their leverage over China, where that might sway China one way or the other, more of like a hardball tactic with Beijing, given this very pretty low outcomes of the summit, and given Chinese seemingly unwillingness to make major concessions. If you're in Brussels, where are you going from here? Plamen, let me start with you, and then Philippe.
Thanks, Lyle. Very briefly, I know we're short of time. I would say that on trade and investment issues, of course, Europe will have to play hardball. For instance, Philippe rightly spoke about Chinese clean tech, which Europe needs. It is true that Chinese companies are, increasingly present in Europe, investing in clean tech, EV or battery assembly plants, all that. In fact, Chinese FDI in Europe has been growing again after its peak in 2016. The Chinese have rightly thought of, getting over the tariff barriers which are being erected in the EU and settling down in Europe itself, on the European market, which I think is a smart strategy. But of course, the EU will have to set its clear-cut terms, that is to say, requirements as to technology transfers, just like China does in its own market. China actually expects foreign investors to transfer their own technologies to their Chinese counterparts. And I think that if Europe does it, here in Europe, this would be a form of reciprocity, the very same reciprocity that European enterprises active in China are denied due to the stringent regulatory regime in the Chinese market. On the geopolitical front, yes, I think that it's becoming quite clear that Europe cannot expect too much from China, because China has made its strategic choices, to quote Xi Jinping himself. Over to you, Lyle.
Great. Philippe?
So we did not mention the US, but not much during this meeting, and it wasn't the purpose of this webinar. But actually, there has been an EU-US trade deal recently, and I think in many ways it feeds the Chinese narrative that the EU is sort of dependent on the US for security and even on economic terms. Now, this is of course not very good for the EU in terms of as a negotiating tool, because we had this opportunity for like 6 months to try to negotiate with the Chinese. The interesting thing is that the Chinese, I think, switched gears maybe a few months ago, maybe in April around that time, and considered that the priority was to talk to the US and strike a deal with Donald Trump. That's what people do these days. And so I don't know really whether in the immediate future, before there is a Trump-Xi meeting, if at all, in the next few months, I think there will be one at some stage, whether the Europeans have any leverage at all. I personally doubt it. Now, on sort of the end game is a slightly different issue, because I do believe the European economy will need more investment and more innovation in many sectors, and not just in green tech and clean tech, but also in services, in maybe in health, in heavy industries, and not infrastructures. I don't think China was right in trying to invest in European infrastructures, but certainly there is space. And the question, as Plamen said, is whether China is prepared to do greenfield investment as opposed to mergers and acquisitions, just taking over a company. They recently took over a company in France called GMD, acquired by a Chinese company. That is actually, not so common these days. But it's acquisition. It's different. So I think, the real question is whether, from a private sector point of view, the Chinese private sector, in technology particularly, is able to have enough leverage to invest in some sectors of Europe with the CCP and the Chinese states backing, because it's always the problem with the private sector. We've seen many Chinese private sector investments in Europe in the past 10 or 15 years. Many of them have withdrawn, have not worked out for some reasons, encountered difficulties, and many investments from China were blocked to Europe because for internal reasons in China. So I hope some of these private companies are able to move forward and talk to European partners and create some proper joint ventures, but with real investments from China, not just acquiring shares and buying a brand, so to speak.
Great discussion. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to some of the questions that were coming in, but please stay tuned for additional events that we will have on EU-China. I know Philippe and others will be writing on this for a while now, and not only the outcome of the summit, but going forward, what to expect from Beijing and Brussels. So a lot to unpack. We just scratched the surface, but Plamen and Philippe, thank you very much. The perspectives from France and Greece, really great insights. Thank you to the audience for joining. Please stay tuned for more CCA events on China and EU-China. For now, signing off. Thank you very much for joining, and take care.